Okay, Alhamdulillah, in today's lecture we were able to take the type of specification that is connected. And there are 5 types. There's exceptions, conditions, descriptions, goals, and to mention part of the whole. The vast majority of the lecture we talked about exceptions because all of the other ones are basically like the exceptions. They're just different types of speech, but they all follow the same rules. So we looked at how we can make an exception, what happens if multiple people are speaking at the same time of an exception, what happens if you exclude the majority of what you just mentioned, what happens, and this was a little bit tricky where we had, I apologize, a stutter step in the recordings, what happens if you have cumulative multiple exceptions in a row that are joined or not joined? Do you add them or are they not added or are they added one to another? So there, you go back to the beginning of the 3rd clip, inshallah, and you'll see all of the examples of that. And then we talked about the ability to link, to make exemptions that go back to the original with specific linking prepositions like the waw and fa, and how we can compare if we have 2 sentences that are joined through language, they do not share the same ruling unless one is mentioned. And then after that, that was sort of what we talked about in exceptions. And after that, we did conditions. And we talked about the conditions as conditioning from something happening in the future, either by mentioning the future or that which is understood as the future. And then we looked at descriptions, which is just adding an adjective basically to what you are, the conditions that you have. And then we looked at goals, and we said that the goal is related to the entire statement that has not been achieved, but we can sometimes include things that are not necessarily in the entire statement as a general way of speech, like وَسَلَامٌ هِيَ حَتَّى مَطْلَعَ الْفَجْرِ, peace on Laylatul Qadr until the coming of the dawn, even though the dawn is not part of the night, because the dawn then begins the next day. It's part of daytime. But that's like a general statement, we can say that. And then to mention part of the whole, and I said some of the ulama don't mention that, but Shaykh al-Islam does, and those are the main topics that we discussed. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa alam. وصلى اللهم على سيدنا مولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. Inshallah, today we are going to talk about, there are 2 types of takhsis, there's 2 types of specifying speech in the discussion of Usul Al Fiqh. There's the connected and the disconnected, meaning speech that's connected to each other and speech that's disconnected. In today's lecture, we are going to talk about the 5 examples of connected speech, and then in the following lecture, tomorrow or the next lecture, inshallah, we'll do the disconnected. So today, it's actually kind of pretty organized for us. We're going to talk, as I said, about the 5 parts of the connected types of exceptions. We're going to talk the 5 parts of connected specifying speech. The first kind is an exception. The second kind are conditions. The third kind is when there's a description. The fourth kind is when there are goals. And the fifth kind is when we mention part of the whole. So those are the main things that we're going to talk about in the lecture. The first one, the exceptions, is going to take up the bulk of the discussion, because the other ones will basically follow and copy the things that we talk about in the first one. So all of the things that we say about the first one, you'll find we don't have to repeat those details on the other ones. And as a matter of fact, he will say, I think when we get to it, I'm pretty sure he says this in the text that I translated. If not, I'll make sure to bring it out from the commentary, that some of these demarcations that he has, some of the authors of Usul don't even talk about, because it's all subsumed under exceptions. I'm going to do, I want you to give me this except this. The illa in the Arabic language. Illa, or some other siwa, ma khala, other types of linguistic constructs we'll talk about. So we want to look about what can you accept, the exception. Can you say, give me 100 except 100, and then therefore it's 0? That doesn't count. Can you do 50-50? Can you do some? Can you do a majority? Can the exception be I say something and then somebody else says an exception? So there are all of these different possibilities that we want to talk about. Why is this important? Because when we give examples from the Quran and the Sunnah, we will start to see, okay, when Allah Ta'ala says something and then the Prophet ﷺ says illa and makes an exception, that's Allah speaking and then the Prophet ﷺ, another party doing the exception. So that's an interesting dynamic. So those are the type of implications that we'll talk about. Hopefully this will be a lighter conversation and pretty straightforward. I'll see you soon in the next clip, inshallah. All right, so inshallah we begin the way we normally begin, which is to look at the original text. And we say, Bismillah, قال المصنف رحمه الله ونفعنا بعلومه في الدارين آمين. Shaykh al-Islam Zakaria al-Ansari rahimahullah, he says, may we benefit, may Allah Ta'ala have mercy on him, and may we benefit from his knowledge in this world and in the next, inshallah. وهو قسمان. Specification is of two kinds. متصل وهو خمسة. متصل ومنفصل. متصل is the connected, that's what we're going to do, and then the منفصل, that's in the next. So the متصل وهو خمسة, the specification is of two kinds, connected, and there are 5 types. Okay, so number 1 is الاستثناء. Number 1 is the exceptions. الاستثناء هو إخراج بنحو إلا من متكلم واحد في الأصح. Exceptions is to make an exception by illa or other types of constructs that are known in the language, like khala, wa'ada, wasiwa, etc. by one speaker in the correct opinion. Another opinion says that there can be 2 speakers. So if I say, for example, let me just get his example that he has in the book. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad. Why can't I see this? Okay, if I said جاء الرجال, all of the men came, or the men came, جاء الرجال, and then my friend said إلا زيد, except Zayd. According to the dominant opinion, that except Zayd doesn't count. According to the second opinion, that exception counts. That's important because even though I mentioned in the very beginning they were always fighting against the Mu'tazilites, and sometimes against aspects of tashayyu in usul, that is, we're not here talking about aqidah, but that's very rare. It's mostly the Mu'tazilites, and most of the Mu'tazilite sort of thinking of usul made its way into the Shia usul. That's another topic, for an advanced conversation. We do have differences of opinion within our own school of thought. Okay, so that's important to mention. Why is this important? Because when you have, for example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Tawbah, verse 5, وَاقْتُلُوا الْمُشْرِكِينَ, and kill the polytheists. And we talked about this in a previous. And then we have a hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ says, إِلَّا dhimmi, except the dhimmi. In the exceptions construct, in this case, universally we validate this exception. So you don't say, oh well, according to the dominant opinion, if somebody else does the exception, it doesn't count. Not in the case of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, because both of them are coming from wahi, both of them are coming from revelation. And Allah Ta'ala says about the Prophet وَمَا يَنْتِقُ عَنِ الْهَوَى إِنْ هُوَ إِلَّا وَحْيٌ يُوحَى. He does not speak of his own volition, but it is a revelation. So for us, the revelation is not only the Quran, but it is also the hadith of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. Okay? So to make an exception by illa or another known construct by one speaker in the correct opinion, and now you know that there are some details about that are important to keep in mind. وَيَجُبِ اتصاله عادة في الأصح. The exception must customarily be connected to the original statement in the correct opinion. So if we're like at a dinner table and I'm talking and I say, I want you tomorrow to go to the bookstore and buy all of the books by Imam Shafi'i, and then I have I take a sip of water or I take a bite of food, except the Risala. I have a couple of copies of that in my library. That type of break, urfan, customarily, is considered is acceptable. No one's going to blame us. No one's going to be like, oh, what are you talking about? You said get all of the books, and here are like the 5 copies of Risala that the bookstore had. In that case, it's accepted. If it's longer than that, if like we went to bed and then the next morning, I said accept al-risala, most people would not accept that. In other words, you would have to restate the whole clause from beginning to end. ويجب اتصاله عادة في الأصح أما في المنقطع فمجاز في الأصح. As for a separated exception, for example, if you say no one is in the house except a donkey, it is a metaphoric statement in the dominant position. So, either you're criticizing somebody that's in the house and you're saying that this person's a donkey, or you're not mentioning that there is no living thing in the house except a donkey, but you said no people. So it's a majaz. It's not a haqiqa statement. It's a statement of metaphor in the dominant position. And you'll find that, sometimes you'll find that kind of construct, so that's important. والأصح أن المراد بعشرة في علي عشرة إلا ثلاثة العشرة باعتبار الآحاد ثم أخرجت ثلاثة ثم أسند إلى الباقي تقديرا وإن كان قبله ذكرا. Okay, so this is important. He says, rahimahullah, the correct opinion in the following statement, I owe 10 except 3, is 10. And then 3 is removed and then redistributed to the rest, even if previously stated. Okay, so that's important because exceptions are a part of speech and something that you find in the revelation and the primary sources. So I owe 10 except 3. Well, everyone's going to say that you owe 7. We understand that rationally. We say, okay, you owe 7. But from the mechanics of the statement, what is established is the 10. So in other words, he says it, I think, elsewhere. It's as if you're saying, if I said the statement that we're analyzing is, I owe 10 except 3. That's basically saying the following. I owe what is left from the 10 after the 3 has been taken. In other words, we have something and then we're excluding from it something. So that original thing is what's intended. You can't disappear that original thing completely. So I owe 10 except 3, so that means you got to pay 10 and then withhold 3. Of course, you can withhold before you give. We're not saying you have to give 10 and then 10 and then 3 is returned. But sometimes in some government transactions, by the way, or institutions like tuitions and large or rent or mortgage and these type of large actions, actually that's what happens. You have to pay the whole thing and then the money is credited back to your account. So actually, I'm glad that I thought of that. Alhamdulillah, from Allah's tawfiq, because that's actually exactly what he's saying. And many modern financial transactions have that, because that is the correct way linguistically of how we, from an interpretive point of view, of how we interpret that construct. I owe 10 except 3. Khalas, and you have in your dhimma, you owe 10, but then you're going to exclude the 3. So let me read that again. The correct opinion in the statement, I owe 10 except 3 is 10. And then 3 is removed and then redistributed to the rest, even if previously stated. So I'm going to subtract the 3 from the 10. That's a very silly example, of course, or simple. Let me say not silly, simple example. It's not silly because all of this is important. But when you have exceptions, as he will come to show you, that are very long and cumbersome, it can become quite intense. And I think that's what he's about to give in a second. وَلَا يَصِحُّ مُسْتَغْرِقٌ. You cannot make an exception completely. I can't say I owe 10 except 10. As a matter of fact, in contract law in the Sharia, if you said that because it's batil, you would owe 10. So if I swore an oath, I owe 100,000 except 100,000, then the qadi would be like, okay, yalla, pay 100,000. Because that you can't accept, as he says, وَلَا يَصِحُّ مُسْتَغْرِقٌ. It's not correct, it's not valid to exclude the entirety, so you end up with 0, so it's as if nothing is said. So you revert to what was the first part of the statement, which is I owe. I owe, it's an iqrar, I'm acknowledging and testifying that I owe 100 or 100,000, I think the example I just gave. except 100,000, well, that exception doesn't count, لا يصح. So what is left is what is originally established. So when it comes to contract laws, and I know that people become upset when there's disputes and things like that. المسلمون عند شروطهم. We are, as a people, as a believers, as followers of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, we are at our conditions. So you have to be very careful with how you speak and not be loose in speak, because these things can have tremendous impact when it comes to disputes. We'll pick up this discussion of what we're talking about in the next clip, inshallah. Okay, so the last thing that we mentioned is وَلَا يَصِحُ مُسْتَغْرِقٌ, which is that you cannot make an exception completely, and I think we talked about that enough. Then he says, رحمه الله, وَالْأَصَحُ صِحَّةُ اسْتِثْنَاءِ الْأَكْثَرِ وَالْمُسَاوِي وَالْعَقْدِ الصَّحِيحِ. The correct opinion is that you can make a majority exception or a 50-50 exception, and the contract with this is sound. Okay, so you can say I owe, or you can say I owe 100 except 50. Okay, so that 50 is left, or you can say I owe 100 except 90, so that 10 is left. So 50-50 or a majority exception is included, and you can include that in a contractual form. That contract would be sound. As long as you haven't excluded the entirety, then both the exception and the contract would be sound. And again, just to remind ourselves, we are in this whole conversation talking about a takhsis, or specifying speech. وأن الاستثناء من النفي إثبات وبالعكس. Now this is important because this is also something that we find in our literature. An exception from a negation is confirmation. So I negate something and then I exclude, so I've excluded away from the negation, which means that I have affirmed it. Let me see if there are examples here. Yeah. And the opposite, as he says. So for example, ما قام أحد إلا زيد. Nobody stood, so this is a negation. Nobody stood, I'm negating the standing, and now I'm going to make an exception from that. Nobody stood except Zayd. What do you understand from that? You are affirming that Zayd stood. Okay? So that's why he says, an exception from a negation is confirmation. And vice versa. So if I said, قام القوم إلا زيد, I've made an exception from a confirmation, so that means I've made a negation. قام القوم إلا زيد. All of the people stood except Zayd. All of the people stood is a confirmation. Except Zayd is an exception. An exception from a confirmation is a negation. So you have negated the standing of Zayd from that exception. I hope that that's clear, and you can, obviously these are recorded, so you can watch them again, but that's important. And I'll also add, well, let me just repeat the line for you, and then I'll add what I want to add. An exception from a negation is confirmation, and vice versa, meaning that an exception from a confirmation is negation. Now, another thing, this is underneath a subtopic, underneath a larger topic, which is nefyu ithbat. To negate the negation is to confirm. And this is a logical principle. This is a principle that we have all the way back to Aristotelian logic, and in Islamic logic we've talked about it. It's talked about by the ulama of mantiq, etc. A negation of a negation is confirmation. So you have something that's negated, and then you negate what is negated, so you have confirmed. Okay, this is a logical principle, and this is a derivative of that. So mantiq, and the study of logic, is important because you have logical things, logical arguments that come up. It's not necessary, like you have to I mean, we teach it at the university, of course, and we'll get to that. But it's not like you have to like memorize all of these texts of logic, but you have to know these are logical arguments. So sometimes it's helpful just to isolate them in a text of logic, like the Sulam or Isahuji, or one of those basic texts, and there's like an endless amount of commentaries. As a matter of fact, Shaykh al-Islam himself has a commentary, I believe it's on the Isahuji. So, and that text has been translated, if I'm not mistaken, into English. And I have translated the Sulam, so when we get to that, I'll share you with my translation, inshallah. So it's helpful just to do like a little text, so you're familiar with these type of things. But you see, it's all throughout usul, it's all throughout fiqh, etc. Okay. And then he says, rahimahullah, وَالْمُتَعَدِّدَةُ إِن تَعَاطَفَتْ فَلِلْمُسْتَثْنَ مِنْهُ وَإِلَّا فَكُلٌّ لِمَا يَلِيهِ مَا لَمْ يَسْتَغْرِقْهُ. A repeated exception that relates to the original mention is cumulative, if not related. They build on one another as long as it is not completely removed what is previously mentioned. So, I owe 100 except 10, except 5, except 3, something like that. The default is that the cumulative exceptions, they build on one another as long as you haven't, like we said before, I owe 10, except 5, except 3, except 2. Well, that's 10. So you're basically saying I owe 10 except 10, which is batil, that doesn't work, so you owe 10. So the correct opinion, a repeated exception that relates to the original mention is cumulative. So you're going to add those exceptions one on top of another. If not related, they build on one another as long as it does not completely remove what is previously mentioned. Let's look at the Hashiyah for a second. Okay. And then he says, rahimahullah, وَالْأَصَحُ أَنْ يَعُودُ لِلْمُتَعَاطِفَاتِ بِمُشْتَرَكٍ. The correct position is that exceptions go back to the original with specific linking letters and words like the waw and the fa. So there has to be some type of words, prepositions that are used for that list of exceptions. We said that the exception is used with illa or some other construct. The same thing with groupings. So, for example, somebody would say, تصدق على الفقراء والمساكين والعلماء. Give sadaqah to those that are poor and needy and the scholars. So here we have made that's the atf, we have added into a list, and then we use the word waw for that, the preposition waw for that, or the fa. Do this, fa this, and that's also something very common throughout the Quran and the Hadith literature. A lot of the examples that he gives, or that you'll find, by the way, in this regards, are in the waqf literature. So when the waqif makes a waqf, I'm going to leave this orchard as a waqf for this and this and this and this and that. So a lot of fiqh in endowment law relates to how do we interpret this language, and this is where the exceptions are. very, very important and consequential, because we want to know is such and such person able to benefit from the endowment or not? Are they included or not? Are they excluded or not? And this is where the exclusion language comes in. Okay? So just to repeat, a repeated exception that relates to the original mention is cumulative. If not related, they build on one another as long as it does not completely remove what is previously mentioned. And then he says, rahimahullah, the correct position is that exceptions go back to the original with specific linking letters and words like waw and the fa. And inshallah, in the next lecture, we'll kind of wrap this all up, bi'idhnillah ta'ala. Okay, with your permission, let me just do that last line because I was reviewing it after I hit stop the record, and I realized that I didn't do a good job, but I messed up. It's okay, but let me give you the full example. So let me just read that line one more time. He says, rahimahullah, وَالْمُتَعَدِّدَةُ إِن تَعَاطَفَتْ لِلْمُسْتَثْنَى مِنْهُ وَإِلَّا فَكُلُّ لِمَا يَلِيهِ مَا لَمْ يَسْتَغْرِقْهُ. A repeated exception that is joined to the... joined is a better word than relate. A repeated exception that is joined to the original mention is cumulative. Let's take that one. I owe 10 except for and wa, that's where the joining is, wa and except 3 and except 2. In this case, it's cumulative, so you only owe 1. I owe 10 except for I owe 10 except 4 except 3 except 2. So 4 plus 3, 7 plus 2 is 9. I forget the hand motion. I owe 10 except 4 and except 3 and except 2. So and except 3 and except 2, that means that we're adding the 4 plus the 3 plus the 2, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So now you owe 1. So when you have a repeated exception that is joined to the original, the exceptions are added. If it's not joined, then they build one on another. If they build on one another and they completely equal or are more than the original, then that's batil, we establish the original. Or if they are not joined to one another and they build on one another such that something remains, then the exception is valid. So if you said, I owe 10 except 10 and except 3 and except 2, well, the first negation, the first exception is equal to the first one, so that's batil, so you owe 10 in that example. But if you said, I owe 10 except 5 except 4 except 3, then you end up owing 6. I owe 10 except 4 except 3. I owe, let me look at the book. I owe 10 except 5 except 4 except 3. I owe 10 except 5 except 4 except 3. So that's 6. That's how you get it. That's how you eat. They're cumulative towards one another. Inshallah, that is clear. Okay. والأصح أن يعودوا للمتعاطفات بمشرك. The correct position is that exceptions go back to the original with linking propositions we said, like the waw and the fa. And then he says, وأن القران بين جملتين لفظا لا يقتضي التسوية في حكم لم يذكر. The comparison of two sentences joined through language do not share the same ruling if it is not mentioned. The comparison of two sentences joined through language do not share the same ruling if it's not mentioned. So you have to mention the ruling if there are going to be two separate things together. Otherwise, you can't assume that one is related to the other. Okay. Now, that was number one, believe it or not. Now let's quickly do the last four. Number two is الشرط, conditions. وهو تعليق أمر بأمر كل منهما في المستقبل أو ما يدل عليه وهو كالاستثناء. Conditions are to make one thing contingent on another, both in the future or what references the future, and it is like the exception. So all of the little arguments that we had in the exceptions, I don't have to repeat them here for the conditions. The same thing are for the conditions. The example that he gives is أكرم بني تميم إن جاءوا. Honor the tribe of Bani Tamim if they come. In ja'u. So it's a conditional, meaning in the future, if they come in the future. The future could be like right around the corner, or it could be, a month from now. Okay. And then number three, al-wasfu, our descriptions. Akrim Bani Tamim al-fuqaha. Honor Bani Tamim, the fuqaha, the jurists. So there's a description. So it's very similar. So you exclude from that description things that are not part of the description, and it is just like the exception that we just took. So that's pretty straightforward. And then he says والغاية وهما كالاستثناء, and the goal and description are like exceptions, but I translated them as separate lines. And then he says والمراد غاية صاحبها عموم يشملها ولم يرد بها تحقيقه مثل حتى يعطوا الجزية وأما مثل حتى مطلع الفجر وقطعت أصابعه من الخنصر إلى الإبهام فلتحقيق العموم. Goals are like exceptions. The meaning of a goal is a goal that relates to the entire statement and has yet to be achieved, like the verse, until they pay jizya. To fight them until they pay jizya. So once they pay the jizya, then there's no more fighting. So it has not been achieved. As for the verse, حتى مطلع الفجر, about Laylatul Qadr, until the coming of the dawn, and the statement, I cut his fingers from the pinky to the thumb, it is to establish generality. Because the Fajr is not part of the Layl. سلام هي حتى مطلع الفجر ليلة القدر, the night of power. Peace is on that night and descends, and inshallah we ask Allah Ta'ala to give us Laylatul Qadr. Hatta, until, hatta is for the goal, matla al-fajr, until the fajr, but the fajr is not part of the layl. And we said that the meaning of a goal is a goal that relates to the entire statement but has yet to be achieved. So this is generally, meaning you go all the way up until the end of the night, because after the night comes the fajr. Or the made-up sentence that he made a cut of all of his fingers from the pinky to the thumb. Al-khinsar, these are the fingers in Arabic, are al-khinsar, al-binsar, al-wusta, al-sababa, al-ibham. So he said, I cut from the khinsar to the ibham. Well, if you did that, he has no fingers. So he's saying, I cut the majority of his fingers. It's a general type of statement that he is trying to say. And then lastly he says, وَبَدَلُ بَعْضٍ أَوْ اشتمال ولم يذكر أكثر. To mention part of the whole, and most scholars do not mention it. This is what I was saying in the beginning, that some of these subparts, some of the ulama don't talk about them because they're so similar. But here, because Shaykh al-Islam is Shaykh al-Islam, part of to mention part of the whole. Like if you said أعجبني زيد علمه, I was impressed by Zayd his knowledge, which is a verbatim translation. You would translate it, I'm impressed by Zayd's knowledge, but the way the construct is أعجبني زيد, I was impressed by Zayd علمه, his knowledge. So to mention part of the whole. Okay. The next thing that we're going to talk about, not in this lecture, but in the is the second type, which is the munfasil, which is the separate kind. And then with that, we will have concluded. Believe it or not, all of this we're still in issue 17, on issue 15, and then we will get to issue 16, 17 before we get to the absolute and the restricted. So we're making good progress, alhamdulillah. I'm sorry for the little hiccup in today's lecture. Sometimes it happens, but I like to. It wasn't necessarily a mistake, but I wanted to make it more full, so that's why I repeated a little bit. I apologize to you. I'll talk to you soon, inshallah. Allah ta'ala a'la wa a'lam wa sallallahu ala sayyidina wa mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.